This case remained a mystery with several suspects until forensic evidence provided the inescapable proof.
And guess whose DNA is on that table from the curling iron and the hairdryer?
Imagine coming home to your apartment, the door unlocked, your dinner waiting. Now imagine a predator with 33 years in prison is already inside, waiting in the dark. 24-year-old Rachel Anderson had just celebrated her birthday with friends and family. She was days away from achieving her dream career, her whole future ahead of her. But on a cold January night in Columbus, Ohio, she made one fatal assumption, that her home meant safety. By the next morning, she was gone. But her debit card kept moving across the city, and every transaction was leading police straight to someone with a past that would make even people who think they've seen it all shudder. Rachel Anderson had always known exactly what she wanted to do with her life. Born on January 28, 1994, in Warren, Ohio, Rachel grew up with her younger brother John in a close-knit family. From childhood, she had an unusual dream. She wanted to become a funeral director. While other kids talked about becoming doctors or teachers, Rachel saw dignity in helping families through their darkest moments. She pursued that dream relentlessly. She graduated from Warren Harding High School in 2012, where she was part of the National Honor Society and played soccer and volleyball. She then studied mortuary science at Youngstown State University, making the dean's list and earning scholarships for her dedication. In 2016, Rachel graduated from the Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science with a Bachelor of Science. She became a member of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association and moved to Columbus to begin her internship at Shaw Davis Funeral Home. Rachel was on the verge of everything she'd worked for. Her internship was nearly complete, and a full-time position was within reach. And that's what makes what happens next feel so unreal. She was kind, compassionate, and responsible, a great listener, a hard worker, but also bubbly, outgoing with an infectious laugh. Rachel's friends and colleagues said she lit up a room when she entered. She was like a ray of sunshine. Her mother, Patricia Anderson, said she was smart, funny, witty, and unique. By January 2018, Rachel was living alone in a 2-story apartment on Allegheny Street on the east side of the city. She was about to turn 24 on Sunday, January 28th. It wasn't the kind of birthday that needed a big production, just friends, family, and a weekend that made the move to Columbus feel less lonely. Her younger brother, John Anderson, drove down from Warren to spend the weekend with her. He arrived Friday, January 26th. Friends stopped by Rachel's apartment to hang out. Jonathan Kennedy and his wife, Tina. Jonathan had known Rachel since high school, and she was friends with his sister. Jonathan described the relationship simply. They would see each other often, and they were very good friends. If you've ever moved to a new city, you know what that kind of friendship means. It's not just someone to text. It's the difference between feeling like a visitor and feeling like you belong. The plan was already set. Jonathan and Tina had volunteered to host a birthday party at their home on the west side of Columbus on Saturday night, January 27th, the evening before Rachel's birthday. But before the party, Rachel had to work during the day. And that's where one small, everyday detail came into the story. So ordinary, it barely registered in the moment. And yet, in hindsight, it became the turning point. On Saturday, Rachel handed her brother her primary apartment key. She had to be at work, and John needed to be able to come and go, so she gave him the key, and her only spare key was with Tina Kennedy. It sounds like nothing, a normal choice, the kind of simple decision you'd make without a second thought. But it also meant something else. For that weekend, access to Rachel's home came down to a couple of keys. Rachel got off work and went to the Kennedys' place for the birthday gathering. Around 8 people attended, including Rachel, her brother John, and Jonathan and Tina. People drank and marijuana was used. As the night went on, some of the group stayed back at the house, and part of the group, including Rachel, John, and Tina, went to a dance club. Nothing in the timeline suggests a dramatic turn. It reads like a birthday weekend most people would recognize. Friends you trust, music, the comfortable blur of a Saturday night, and the sense that you've earned one weekend to exhale. At the end of the night, Rachel and John stayed over at the Kennedys' house. But true crime rarely begins with monsters jumping out of shadows. It begins with routines, people doing what they always do, until one tiny variable changes. Routine is a kind of anesthesia. It makes you stop scanning for danger. Sunday morning, January 28th, Rachel and her brother returned to her apartment. John stayed about 30 to 45 minutes, then left around 1 p.m. to drive back to Warren. And when he pulled away, he didn't hand the key back. He drove off with it. Later, John and Rachel communicated about the key to her apartment that he hadn't returned. And Jonathan Kennedy testified that Rachel called and texted him on Sunday because her brother had gone home without giving her main key back. Now, in real life, it isn't terror, it's irritation. That quick, hot spike of seriously? The mental checklist starts immediately. How do I get in? Who has a spare? How fast can I fix this? Because you don't think you're stepping into a crime case. You think you're solving a small, stupid problem. And Rachel, responsible and organized, reacted quickly. Cell phone data later showed she called her brother at 1:58 p.m. A minute later, she texted Jonathan Kennedy about the key. Jonathan and Tina arranged for her to come pick up the spare key later that evening, after they returned from driving another party attendee back home to Athens, Ohio. At 6:17 p.m., Rachel texted Jonathan again, saying she'd head over in about 20 minutes. Jonathan testified that she came to their house sometime between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m., stayed a little less than 15 minutes, and left with that spare apartment key. It's the kind of nothing moment most of us have lived through and forgotten by the next morning. But for Rachel, that missing key didn't just change her evening. It changed her path. Her door could only be locked from the outside with a key, so she had to leave it unlocked when she went out. And once she left with that spare key, the story narrowed into a small window, one that investigators would later rebuild minute by minute, trying to understand what happened after she went back into the night. Cell phone records showed that on Sunday, January 28th, Rachel's phone activity slowed and then stopped entirely. Her last incoming call came from her mother at 6:30 p.m., and it lasted nearly 10 minutes, long enough for small talk, for a mother to hear her daughter's voice and feel for that moment that everything was fine. Think about how most of us use our phones. A quick reply, a be right there. It's almost automatic. And that's the brutal thing about last calls. We want them to be meaningful. We want there to be a clue, a goodbye, some line that points toward what's coming. It was the final incoming call recorded on her phone. After that, her phone went quiet. No more calls, no more texts. Around 7:30, she stopped at Arby's on the east side, and then she went home. Rachel was always on time for her work at the funeral home. She returned calls promptly and treated every family she served with genuine care. That's exactly why, on the morning of January 29th, 2018, when she didn't show up for work, people immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Calls went straight to voicemail, and text messages sat unanswered. Rachel's co-workers at Shaw Davis Funeral Home grew increasingly worried. It's a human instinct to rationalize first, because the alternative is too heavy. Maybe she overslept or lost track of time. But this simply wasn't like her. By mid-morning, her supervisor asked a colleague, Trent Snyder, who handled deliveries, to drive to Rachel's apartment and check on her. When he arrived at the apartment complex a little after noon, Rachel's door was locked. He knocked, but there was no answer. He called out her name. Still nothing. And while he stood there, trying to talk himself into a normal explanation, he looked through the windows and saw something that made the whole place feel strangely frozen in time. He noticed a candle burning on a coffee table. This small detail didn't belong in a normal morning, like the night in that apartment never ended. And there was something else. Rachel's car was in the parking lot, but not where she normally parked it. It was parked around the corner, unusual enough to set off alarm bells. Growing concerned, he contacted the apartment manager, but without Rachel's permission, they couldn't enter. So, Snyder called the Columbus Police Department. When officers arrived, everything looked normal. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Eventually, the property manager got permission to enter the apartment from Sean Griggs, Rachel's former roommate and ex-boyfriend, who was still on the lease. The manager unlocked the door, did a quick walkthrough of the two-story unit, and blew out the candle. She told everyone she hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. Snyder and the police left, but the worry didn't die down. Rachel's manager at work was still concerned and made another call to Rachel's friend, Jonathan Kennedy. Jonathan came to the apartment. There, he waved down a passing police officer for help. With police there, the property manager allowed access again. Inside, Kennedy noticed something others didn't see. There was leftover food on the table, untouched. Kennedy knew immediately this was wrong. Rachel was meticulous about cleanliness. She would never leave food out overnight. He insisted on a more thorough search. After checking the first floor, he went upstairs. Seconds later, he screamed. Upstairs, Kennedy tried to open the bedroom closet, but something was pulling the door back from the other side. When he finally opened it, he saw Rachel inside the closet. He tried to help her, but then realized she was dead. The officer testified that Jonathan came out looking pale and freaked out. The scene was disturbing. She was found partially clothed, with ligature restraint and evidence of vocal obstruction. The officer immediately called in forensics, and the entire apartment complex was cordoned off as a crime scene. The autopsy revealed the grim details of what Rachel had endured. The medical examiner determined that Anderson's death was caused by strangulation and a stab wound to her head and neck. Investigators recovered several ligatures at the scene, including cords from various household appliances, which the medical examiner used to reconstruct the crime. Furthermore, forensic evidence confirmed that a sexual battery had occurred. The marks on Rachel's wrists indicated that she had been conscious during the restraint. Immediately, detectives ran into a puzzle that seemed almost unreal. No signs of forced entry at either the front or back doors, no witnesses. And the apartment door was locked after the crime. In behavioral forensics, there is a concept known as the perfect entry, a moment where a security gap and a fatal oversight collide. Whoever did this had either been let inside or already had access. Rachel's purse was lying on the floor. It appeared to have been dumped out. Nearby were the following items: an Arby's receipt dated January 28th at 7:32, her driver's license, an Arby's cup, a fry box, an opened ketchup packet, a cell phone, a laptop, a water bottle, cigarette and cigar butts, and a glass smoking pipe. But there was no cash and no credit cards, and neither the key to Rachel's apartment nor her car keys were recovered. 2 weeks later, while Rachel's mother was going through boxes of items taken from her daughter's apartment, she discovered a 9-inch knife that wasn't found by police during the earlier searches. Investigators believed it was used in the murder. Then detectives heard something startling from Rachel's younger brother, John Anderson. He said he suspected someone who might be responsible. He thought it was Rachel's friend, Jonathan Kennedy. He and his wife had a spare key to Rachel's apartment. John testified that about 2 weeks before the birthday weekend, his sister told him she'd become uncomfortable around Kennedy. She described feeling sexual vibes from him during an LSD trip, said he called her a virus, and confessed she was afraid of him. That was the kind of detail that sounded like a warning sign. However, John admitted that during the actual birthday weekend, he observed nothing abnormal. Everything seemed friendly and fine between Rachel and the Kennedys, and Rachel acted like nothing ever happened. Detectives swabbed both John and Jonathan for DNA, but neither man's DNA was found on Rachel's body or on the ligatures. There was DNA linked to Jonathan, but it was exactly where you'd expect it to be if he'd been in the apartment during the welfare check, on a Pepsi can and a pipe from the first floor, not on the parts of the scene that mattered most. And Jonathan had an alibi. He told detectives he was with Tina that evening. So, the friend with the key theory shattered. The search for the invisible intruder was back to square one. John Anderson also told police about other possible suspects, an ex-boyfriend and a man in the apartment complex Rachel had complained about. Both men were investigated and determined not to have been in Columbus at the time of the murder. Each lead collapsed. Then a break in the case came from an unexpected source, Rachel's debit card. Once detectives realized Rachel's card was missing, Detective Hughes contacted her bank to pinpoint where it had been used and obtained surveillance footage from those locations. That's how the locked door paradox turned into a trail. In the hours after her death, her card was used at multiple locations across Columbus, at convenience stores and ATMs. Small purchases, nothing extravagant, just routine transactions that wouldn't immediately trigger fraud alerts. This paints the killer as a cold, impulsive opportunist, rather than a mastermind. On January 28th, Rachel's card was used at 9:43 p.m. at a food mart on East Main Street, within a mile or two of her apartment. That time matters, because at 9:43, the people who loved Rachel still didn't know anything was wrong. It was just a quiet night in Columbus, while her card was already being used. The digital trail proved that a monster was already roaming the streets, spending Rachel's future one small transaction at a time. It wasn't until detectives saw surveillance footage of Rachel's car at multiple local stores that they understood it had been moved after the crime. The investigation shifted from a mystery to a manhunt. The car turned into a mobile crime scene that was now crisscrossing the city. One clip showed her car parked outside a store. A man got out of the passenger side, walked inside, went to an ATM and back, captured on camera. The driver's hand could be seen, but he never got out. He remained invisible the whole time. The men using the card moved casually and methodically. To the person holding that card, this wasn't a high-stakes robbery. This was just a predator treating a human life like a temporary source of income. It showed a terrifying lack of empathy, the ability to extinguish a light like Rachel's, and then immediately stand in line at a food mart to buy a drink or cigarettes with her own money. Whoever was behind the crime knew no mercy. He was simply feeding his immediate needs with the total, casual indifference toward the human life he had just destroyed. The card was used several times that same evening, and the surveillance kept showing the same man exiting the passenger side while the driver never left the car. This wasn't the behavior of a panicked amateur. It was the calculated move of a man who understood how to stay off the radar. The man getting out of the passenger side wasn't a ghost. In fact, someone at that store knew exactly who he was. Detective Art Hughes testified that a store clerk identified the man as Anthony Sleet, described as a guy who frequently stayed around that store's parking lot, someone living on the fringes of Columbus society. That changed the investigation instantly, because now the mystery passenger became a real person who could be found. So detectives waited for him to appear again. On February 6th, when Sleet returned to his usual spot, the clerk contacted Hughes, and patrol officers brought Sleet to police headquarters for questioning. Sleet told detectives that on the night of January 28, 2018, he was panhandling outside a store on Main Street on the east side of Columbus, when a man approached him and offered a deal that sounded like a lifeline. Help him get money off a debit card, and in exchange, Sleet would get a warm place to sleep. According to Sleet, the man claimed he'd had a falling out with his girlfriend and said she was trying to take his money, so he wanted to use her card. The man already knew the PIN. To Sleet, who was struggling for a roof over his head, this didn't look like a crime in progress. Sleet agreed and became an unwitting accomplice, a pawn in a much deadlier game. But in his attempt to stay hidden, the predator made a critical mistake. He chose a man who was too well known in his own neighborhood. By trying to outsource his guilt, he inadvertently handed the police a lead. Sleet insisted he had never met the man before. He described him as dark-skinned, with a stocky build, short hair, and a slightly southern accent, estimating he was in his late 30s or early 40s, though he said the man could have been younger. Sleet also described the vehicle the man was driving as a small green four-door station wagon-type car. According to Sleet, the man drove him to multiple places where Sleet used the card at ATMs. Sleet told detectives he tried to withdraw $2,000 at one point, but only managed to get $40. The driver suggested trying again at other locations, and Sleet said they went to a nearby food mart as part of that night's attempts. By Sleet's account, he ultimately got around $400 and bought cigarettes and other items while using the card. And then came the part that makes the hotel room offer feel less like kindness and more like manipulation. Sleet said the man never got him a room. Instead, the predator exploited a vulnerable person's desperation, and after the withdrawals and stops, once he was no longer useful, he dropped Sleet back off at the same place he'd been panhandling. Sleet's story was a window into the killer's cold, calculating mind. Sleet was cooperative with police and agreed to provide his own DNA sample. On the afternoon of Monday, January 29th, Rachel's card was used on the north side of Columbus at a fine fare food market on Cleveland Avenue. The surveillance video from that location showed a man using the debit card at an ATM with his face carefully concealed. On that same day, the debit card was used again across multiple locations: City Trends, the DSW at Easton, a Kroger on the west side of Columbus, and Hollywood Casino. And the videos from those locations showed something new. Sometimes it was a man and a woman together. Sometimes it was just the woman. The card was used 2 more days, January 30th and February 1st, again near Cleveland Avenue, at Fine Fair Food Market, and at a market just east of downtown Columbus. And again, surveillance showed a man, this time with his face partially concealed. Perhaps his initial caution was being eroded by a sense of invincibility. Most people assume a killer would want to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the crime, but human psychology often works the opposite way. We return to what we know. The bank records kept circling back to the same area, like the people behind the transactions felt safe there. These locations weren't random. They were a map of the group's comfort zone. Eventually, that surveillance trail led somewhere detectives didn't expect it to go, inside a family relationship. The stores where the card had been used were within walking distance of the home of 56-year-old Deborah Pardon. She ended up cooperating with detectives, and prosecutors called her to testify. Deborah told them she had a brother who would stay at her Linden area residence from time to time. She also testified that he would occasionally drive her green 4-door Hyundai Accent or their mother's blue Toyota Corolla. Then came the part that tied the surveillance footage together. Deborah admitted she improperly used the debit card at multiple places, and she identified herself and her brother, 53-year-old Anthony Pardon, as the man and woman seen on camera spending Rachel's money. According to Deborah, her brother gave her the card and a PIN. She testified that she saw the name Anderson on the card and assumed it belonged to her brother's girlfriend, Bernita Anderson. This might explain why Deborah didn't ask questions. Prosecutors told her she wouldn't be charged for using the card if she was truthful about what happened. Deborah testified that her brother also stayed at the apartment of his girlfriend, Bernita Anderson, who lived on Allegheny Street, in the same complex as Rachel Anderson. From the back of Bernita's apartment, you could see the back door of Rachel's. And there was one more proximity detail that detectives documented. Bernita's daughter, Allison Gamble, had lived in that same complex in the unit directly next door to Rachel until moving out in December 2017, just weeks before the murder. In true crime, that's the kind of information that reframes everything you thought you knew, because suddenly it suggests a terrifying level of familiarity. It suggests someone who already knew the layout of that space. For days, Deborah Pardon had lived in a state of carefully constructed denial. But when she learned about Rachel's murder on the local news, she said it made her sit straight up in bed. She panicked because she knew she was in trouble for using the card. Over the next few days, she repeatedly searched for information about the murder on her cell phone. And at some point, Deborah confronted her brother. She testified that he told her not to ask questions about the card. In that moment, Deborah made a choice that many humans make when the truth is too heavy to carry. She chose to believe that if he didn't want to talk about it, it was because he didn't know anything either. Maybe it was a classic defense mechanism. We often believe the lies that protect our peace of mind and avoid seeing the monster sitting at our own kitchen table. Police didn't think that she actually knew what was going on. Blinded by her own tragedy, Deborah was grieving the loss of her daughter, who had just passed away in a car crash on 11th Avenue. Deborah said, "I got 2 kids, and I can't even view her body because her face is so messed up. I got a funeral to plan and 2 grandbabies, 3 and 6. One neighbor said he had spent time with Pardon's family and couldn't imagine Pardon killing a woman. Pardon was described as looking clean-cut and well-dressed. This is a textbook example of the halo effect, where we subconsciously believe that a well-groomed, well-dressed man is a good person and couldn't possibly be capable of depravity." The neighbor said about Pardon, "He was so well-groomed, watch, hair. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing." Other neighbors said the home where Pardon was living was a little house with big secrets. It's one of life's most uncomfortable truths. You truly never know what is happening behind closed doors, even when the person on the other side looks exactly like a man you can trust. By this point, detectives had the stolen card, the surveillance footage, and the sister's testimony. But in the eyes of the law, there was still a massive gap in the case. Using a stolen card is a felony, but it isn't a murder conviction. To a jury, Anthony Pardon could have simply been a scavenger, a man who found a discarded card and took advantage of a lucky break. To get a conviction for what happened to Rachel, the police had to prove he was the one inside her apartment during those final, terrifying moments. To do that, they turned to the one thing the suspect couldn't control, manipulate, or lie to. The device most people carry everywhere without a second thought: their phone. In modern investigations, criminals don't just have to worry about witnesses or cameras. They have to worry about the silent witness in their pocket. There is a profound irony in the criminal mind. A predator can be careful enough to stay out of a camera's frame, pull up a hood, or hide inside a car, yet completely forget that their phone is broadcasting a play-by-play of their movements to a satellite. BCI and the Columbus Police Digital Forensics Team analyzed the suspect's cell phone activity and compared it to the timeline of the crime. Their cell site analysis showed that on Sunday, January 28th, between 7:45 p.m. and 9:14 p.m., the exact window when Rachel was killed, the suspect's phone was pinging off the cell tower closest to Rachel's apartment complex, the same complex where his girlfriend lived. Because Pardon had a Gmail account and had location services enabled on his phone, Google was able to provide police with much more precise location information than cell tower records alone. According to that data, Pardon's phone was in the immediate area of the victim's apartment from about 8:04 to 9:25 p.m. on the night of the murder. And the location data was specific enough to rule out his girlfriend's apartment in another building of the same complex. It placed him at the exact coordinates of Rachel's unit. By that point, Rachel's phone had already gone silent earlier that evening, and Pardon's phone started traveling with the card. Google geolocation data placed the suspect's phone near multiple locations tied to the card usage. Investigators testified that the suspect's outgoing calls on January 29th occurred near City Trends and DSW at the times Rachel's debit card was used at those locations, and his phone could be traced to towers in those areas at those times. It's the kind of trail investigators sometimes call digital receipts. You don't have to confess. Your phone keeps the record anyway. Anthony Pardon was arrested on February 9th as he was leaving his sister's residence and getting into a car. Police then searched the sister's home, where they found clothing with City Trends tags and 2 casino receipts. The car was also searched. Investigators found a baseball cap and gloves that mirrored the man on the surveillance tapes, along with more clothing with tags, a cell phone, a knife, and an air pistol, which isn't technically a firearm, even though it resembles one. Pardon was held in jail on a staggering $5 million bond. In the legal world, a number that high is a statement of extreme danger. Pardon was charged with aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, sexual assault, and aggravated murder. Pardon wasn't cooperating with police and entered not guilty pleas to every charge. Detectives ran Pardon's name through the system, and what they found was chilling. Anthony Pardon was a repeat Tier 3 sex offender with a criminal history spanning over 3 decades. To the legal system, this status is essentially a red alert. It's reserved for the most serious offenses and carries a lifelong requirement to register with the sheriff every 90 days. Just 6 months before Rachel's disappearance, a wave of unease had hit a nearby Columbus neighborhood. Residents received a formal warning letter stating that 3 high-risk offenders were living among them. Pardon's name was on that list. But identifying the danger doesn't actually stop it from walking through your door. The trajectory of this danger began decades earlier, in March 1979. Anthony Pardon was just 14 years old when he claimed his first victim, an 8-year-old girl. Following the assault, he was committed to the Ohio Youth Commission and eventually shuffled into the foster care system, a move intended to rehabilitate a troubled teenager, but one that also placed him in a position of ultimate trust. In 1980, the depravity escalated. He was 15 at the time, and one day was babysitting the 9-month-old son of his foster parents. while his foster mother went grocery shopping. It was during those brief moments of isolation that Pardon committed the unthinkable. When questioned by police, he said he was upset after an argument with his girlfriend. To a 15-year-old with a normal moral compass, a fight with a girlfriend leads to a closed door or a long walk. To Pardon, it was a trigger for a predatory impulse. It was a glimpse into a psyche that viewed other human beings as objects that could be used for his own needs by exploiting their vulnerabilities. He was convicted as a juvenile. At the time, a court-ordered psychiatrist issued a hauntingly accurate prophecy. Pardon needed intensive treatment and had to be watched closely. On November 13, 1981, 16-year-old Pardon, then a student at Lyndon McKinley High School, arrived at the Ontario Street home of his girlfriend's 39-year-old mother and asked her to use the phone. He used the victim's kindness to gain entry, but the moment she let him inside, the mask vanished. He pulled a butcher knife, instantly turning a neighborhood home into a crime scene. What followed was a brutal violation. After the assault, he took roughly $100 from the victim's purse. After that, Pardon didn't just want to flee. He wanted to ensure there was no one left to tell the story. Using ligatures, he placed the woman into the trunk of her own car and drove her to a remote area near Valley Dale. He threw her into the dark waters of Alum Creek to ensure she could never testify, treating her in his mind as a piece of evidence that needed to be destroyed. When his victim managed to stay afloat, fighting for her life, Pardon escalated, trying to make her disappear into the current. He was only interrupted because a bystander happened to intervene, scaring him off. Against all odds, the woman survived. Pardon left before police arrived, and later used the stolen money to buy tennis shoes and a jogging outfit. There was no remorse or panic, just the cold satisfaction of a predator who would easily trade a human life for a new wardrobe. When you look at the 1981 case, you see a chilling blueprint for Rachel Anderson's tragedy. It was the behavior of a man who had become institutionalized and viewed every person as a resource to be harvested. The boy who had once betrayed his foster parents' trust became a teenager with the cold-blooded instincts of a seasoned killer, capable of dismantling a human life in a matter of minutes. Predators like Pardon don't usually start with grand, complex schemes. They start with the neighborly request, a phone, a glass of water, a question about the mail. For Pardon, trust was his real weapon. To him, a personal connection wasn't a reason for mercy. It was an opportunity for access. A psychologist said that Pardon can't control antisocial and aggressive behavior and has a strong resistance to change. This time, Pardon was tried as an adult and received a prison sentence of 5 to 25 years. Prison records noted multiple disciplinary violations, including weapons possession, setting a mattress on fire, and fighting. He was declared a sexual predator in 1999. Pardon ultimately spent over 24 years behind bars and was released in November 2006. He moved to Georgia and applied for a maintenance job using a false name, a move that allowed him to hide his history from unsuspecting employers. In 2007, he was charged in Georgia with forgery and failing to register as a sex offender, and served an additional 9 years. When he was released in 2017, he was supposed to be monitored closely. A judge in Georgia had ordered him to wear a GPS ankle monitor. However, when Pardon returned to Ohio, the Ohio Adult Parole Authority failed to provide a monitor, citing how long monitoring would be needed and the cost. In an absurd, bureaucratic decision, the safety of the community was traded for the price of a battery and a device. This choice would haunt the city of Columbus. In August 2017, just months before Rachel's murder, Pardon was caught with a female sex worker in his car and later stopped for driving without a license. During that traffic stop, officers found a chilling kit in his possession: a pocket knife, a kitchen knife, and a pellet gun. He was not arrested. On June 19th, Pardon was scheduled to appear in court for a pre-trial hearing, but he did something rarely seen in a Franklin County courtroom. He refused to show up. He accused prosecutor Ron O'Brien of turning the case into a sideshow and said he didn't want to be paraded in front of news cameras. Judge Stephen McIntosh, the court reporter, prosecutors, and Pardon's defense attorneys went to his holding cell, but he still wouldn't take part in the hearing. Then, in December 2019, Pardon sent a handwritten letter to the media. In the letter, he wrote that he didn't kill anyone and this case is only because of his past. He also claimed he knew Anderson, had been inside her apartment, and that they had gotten high together. O'Brien responded that Pardon could have known Anderson had THC in her system, the active component of cannabis, because he had access to her autopsy information. O'Brien also said there was no evidence Anderson knew Pardon and described the letter as a tactic to delay the trial and a desperate act. In the letter, Pardon added, "I feel deeply for the Anderson family, but I didn't kill their loved one, and I can and will prove it." The Tier 3 predator who had spent 40 years behind bars perfecting the art of the lie was now trying to gaslight an entire city from a jail cell. But once the trial began, image management ran into something harder to control: evidence. On January 24, 2020, Pardon fired his attorneys, ignoring Judge McIntosh's warnings about the risks of representing himself. His former lawyers, Isabella Dixon and Larry Thomas, were kept on as standby counsel in case he changed his mind.
I'm not happy with this here at all. I don't feel that I'm getting represented in no kind of 100% way at all.
Then, on January 27th, the day jury selection began, the reality finally seemed to break through. Pardon reversed course and decided not to represent himself. The trial began on February 4th, 2020. Members of Anderson's family sat together on a courtroom bench, quietly holding hands and wiping away tears. Pardon didn't perform for the room. He looked down or straight ahead.
And though it might be sad and may be hard, you said you could do it. You have to quit.
Anthony Sleet, a key witness who used Rachel Anderson's card, had died in the fall of 2018. It meant there would never be a live witness to point at the hidden driver and say, "That's the man." The defense leaned into the parts that didn't neatly match the person on trial. Sleet described the driver as looking younger than the defendant. Sleet was shown a photo array and picked a photo that he believed was the person who drove the car. However, the defendant's photo wasn't in that array because he wasn't a suspect yet. And the defense highlighted a frustrating investigative gap. Sleet insisted the initial conversation with the driver was on camera, but detectives failed to obtain that potentially helpful video. The defense argued that without that video, the Sleet interview was inadmissible hearsay. The defense said that the surveillance videos showed Sleet was the first person to use the victim's credit card, and argued that the data doesn't show who was in possession of the phone at any given moment. But there was one type of evidence that didn't need a witness or proof of possession: DNA.
And guess whose DNA is on that table from the cooling iron and the hairdryer? Anthony Pardon's.
Pardon's DNA was where only the perpetrator's DNA could be. Sleet's DNA wasn't found at the crime scene. A forensic scientist testified that the DNA profile was consistent with the defendant's DNA profile. It didn't mean it might include a group of random men, but it was consistent with a narrow paternal line group, meaning it pointed directly to the defendant, his brother from the same father, his father, and paternal grandfather. For a Tier 3 predator, this was his signature. According to Pardon's defense attorneys, he had an abused, dysfunctional, chaotic childhood. They said he was raised by his grandparents before later living with his mother, and then, starting at age 16, he spent most of his life in prison. Defense attorney Isabella Dixon centered her closing argument for Pardon's life on trauma that she said he had never been without. She said, "This is someone who had never had any guidance, who had not shown love. What we see here is extreme physical and emotional neglect." The defense argued that various mitigating factors, including Pardon's dysfunctional upbringing, should carry more weight than the aggravating circumstances of the crime. Prosecutors responded that the aggravating circumstances outweighed any mitigation. Prosecutor Ron O'Brien told the jury the evidence showed Pardon understood his actions, describing them as robbery and assault. He also argued that, given Pardon's age at the time and the choices he made, whatever happened in his childhood should be given no mitigating weight. Dr. Bob Stinson, a forensic psychologist who spent nearly 9 hours with Pardon, said that a traumatic childhood with an abusive, alcoholic father and a neglectful, frequently absent mother, plus Pardon's experiences in prison, contributed to various psychological problems, including post-traumatic stress disorder and conduct disorder, that grew into an antisocial personality disorder during his adult years. He said that after Pardon got out of prison, he never received any treatment even though he requested it. When he was 23, he was reading at a third-grade level. Dr. Stinson believed that Pardon likely had some form of brain damage. On February 19th, Pardon gave jurors a 13-minute unsworn statement in which he talked about his abusive childhood. He also described his struggles after getting out of prison, saying that when he was released, nobody gave him nothing. He struggled to get a job because of his background. He claimed the system failed him, the prison system and social services failed him, and said that his abusive father and the system made him who he was today. He didn't directly address Anderson's murder, show remorse, or offer an apology, though he did say he had made a lot of bad choices in his life and that people could blame him for that.
Don't surprise me. Don't surprise me. But if I blame Anthony Pardon, you can blame me. I made choices. The choices I made, I blame those choices. I made those choices. I never said I did. I made the choices I made in life. Some of them was bad, some of them was good. But I made a lot of bad choices in my life. But people blame, you can blame me for that.
Prosecutor Jennifer Rausch addressed Pardon's statement in closing, pointing to his choices and criminal record and telling jurors that, at some point, the blame doesn't shift to anyone else. This wasn't the jury's fault, the prosecutor's fault, or the system's fault. It was his fault. O'Brien also responded that Pardon's statement focused on himself and tried to cast others as the reason he shouldn't be held responsible for his crimes. Pardon entered Anderson's apartment at around 8 p.m. He moved Rachel from the downstairs area to the upstairs. He restrained her and forced her to give him her PIN. After she gave him the PIN, he went on with the nightmare. When prosecutors projected a crime scene photo of Rachel's body onto the courtroom screen, Judge Stephen McIntosh admitted that even he was startled by the brutality of the crime. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Pardon guilty on all counts. Anthony Pardon was officially death penalty eligible, but in the final hour, the jury deadlocked on the recommendation of execution. Instead, they recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Stephen McIntosh imposed 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 63 years for aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively. Rachel's father delivered a statement expressing shock that a repeat violent offender had been allowed to walk free and commit another horrific crime. He said, "The system failed, but it didn't fail Anthony Pardon. It failed Rachel Anderson." Rachel's mother stated, "My daughter is Rachel Nicoletta Anderson. She is not a case number." She also expressed disapproval of the fact that the money that she pays in taxes will support Pardon in prison. Pardon didn't react to Rachel's parents' words. Anthony Pardon had spent his entire life becoming the worst version of himself. Despite his documented history of extreme violence, bureaucratic failures and budget cuts allowed him to live unsupervised and unmonitored. What makes this case so haunting is how preventable it was. So here's the question for you. When repeat violent offenders are released back into society, what safeguards should be in place to protect innocent people? And who should be held accountable when those safeguards fail? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.